You've talked about the massive emergence of religious beliefs, practices, rituals in the human past as indicative of, if not a proof of God, but the fact that religion is so important in human development being an important fact that we have to deal with.
That's exactly right. But I believe, Robert, that we can only approach this through the traditions in which we are born. It's like being born into a family name and tradition. We are born into certain traditions, but we're not the prisoners of those traditions. You and I cannot pretend that we can go back to 30,000 years ago and be shamans all over again. But we can say, okay, I was born into a Jewish or a Christian or a Catholic or whatever tradition, and I can break free from that, or I can reinvent it, or I can rethink it. So our starting points are always our traditions. But how we deal with that are different for very different philosophical, psychological, and other reasons. So I don't think where we end up in terms of personal faith, when you look at a huge problem like prehistory and the hominid history, is going to be the result of one philosophical conversation or one psychological test. It is always going to be a complex personality issue. And why do certain people stay with a religious faith and why do others not do that? I think those are complex issues, but what I would resist is the idea that science has proven once and for all that religion or the religious disposition is the kind of primitive leftover from the past. Why would we discriminate against religious dispositions when our human consciousness is so complex? I mean, there too we should try to understand better, try to pursue better what it might mean and how that could be integrated. So I have a big problem in seeing that as something that has been left behind.
The argument would be is that human consciousness, because of its self-awareness, produces this desire for religion, but that the religion is an artifact of consciousness as opposed to the theological idea that religion is the purpose of consciousness. One, it's the artifact, the other, it's the purpose.
Yeah. Well, I don't, yes, I know those arguments well, but I also believe that those arguments cannot be made conclusively in terms of, say, evolutionary psychology or neuroscience only. In the end, it's a deep commitment that even if, in terms of my own consciousness, I have to deal with the way that this artifact has been created in the history of humankind, and also for me, there may be more behind this. That decision, whether you or I may go or not with it, is not going to be a scientific decision. And I think that decision is something that I think should be respected. It's, of course, problematized by people who may take these extreme or fundamentalist views in religion and thereby kind of mess up, I think, what is good about spirituality and thinking critically about spirituality. But I know you want to know about truth and how do you know and all of that. I think that the most we can the most we can argue for is a sense of coherence, a sense of high plausibility. Why, in the light of this tradition, after having been critical of all the foundationalists and other problematics, could I come to a position where I could have the sanitized view that still makes personal sense for me in terms of my worldview and what I expect from the future. I'm not arguing for a grand view that God has now given us this consciousness as purpose and it should be empirically demonstrable. But I do have a problem when it's easily passed over and not seriously approached in the interdisciplinary conversation.
But if you are a real theologian who really believes in God in a theistic, traditional way, You have to believe that God created human consciousness for a special purpose to have these religious beliefs and understandings and appreciations.
Yeah. Now, remember earlier I talked about convergences or lines that are running parallel. So I'm very aware of what I can say as a theologian and what I cannot say. I would not be able to tell you, say as a neuroscientist, that, oh, I have news for you. God created this consciousness with a special purpose. But I can say that what I see in the history of our species and what neuroscience, cognitive science, paleoanthropology, evolutionary biology is explaining to us by the day in an exciting way, what I see there, I find consonant with or convergent with. As a theologian, I believe that God created, has this purpose for this species. But I could never enforce that or blur that with scientific lines, but it would be a perspective that would be valid, that would feed into my theology, even as my theological perspective that comes alongside in the interdisciplinary conversation, hopefully opens up a way for me to say, as a theologian, yes, I see, I can now talk about direction, purpose, but then I firmly moved out of the interdisciplinary conversation into what a colleague of mine calls the intradisciplinary conversation. Then we're back into the folds of theology where we do our own thing, as it were, which is true for every discipline. But in those
And you feel that's entirely legitimate?
I don't think you can exist on the boundaries all the time. At some point, unless you're an interdisciplinary theologian, which is what I'm trying to do. But yes, at some point, I think what we've gained from the sciences should be taken back. For instance, just think about the richness that we can learn from cosmology and physics about how this planet came, or this universe came into existence. That should be transported back intradisciplinary into theology.
When you're back in your theology, in your intradiscipline, bounded by the walls of your theology, how then do you view human consciousness?
Then I hope to not forget everything that I've learned in the transversal conversation with the sciences, but to incorporate all of that into my own theological view, but not the philosophical conclusion that therefore religion is only an artifact, but certainly the richer notion of consciousness that would, from a theological point for me, now gives a certain kind of purpose to who we are. By the way, and I would also feel very sympathetic to thinking about what this may mean to our cousins in the animal world and what that means in terms of a longer history of creation. So I don't want to create the idea that I am insulating myself against within the walls of my own disciplines. All these images are difficult. But I do believe that we should be going back and forth and visit and have these transversal connections and thereby enrich the interdisciplinary conversation and free theology from its insularity.